This is MetroFocus.
Good evening and welcome to Election 2020, a MetroFocus special. I'm Rafael P. Roman. Tonight we conclude our series on the 2020 election with a focus on the voters and their voice. We're not just over a week away from the Iowa caucuses when, for the first time, Democratic primary voters will have their say in who will ultimately be the candidate to take on President Donald Trump in November. After a year of nonstop campaigning, it all comes down to this: the voters. It will start with Iowa, then it will move on to New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina later in February. But this year, the nomination may very well be decided in April, when the primaries will come to a handful of states, including New York. But what if there is no presumed nominee even by then? Could we actually see a brokered Democratic convention where other names may emerge, names such as Hillary Clinton or Michelle Obama? And regardless of who wins the nomination or who wins the presidency, what will the country look like after November? Will it manage to come together, or will it be divided even further? That's our focus tonight, and here to break it all down for us are Nayela Amaru, a policy strategist and Iraq veteran, J.C. Polanco, a political commentator and former president of the NYC Board of Elections, and Jarrett Murphy, executive editor of the New York City-focused news organization, City Limits. Welcome back, all of you.
Thanks for having us.
It's always a pleasure to have you here. So let's start here at home with the New York Times double endorsement of Senators Warren and Klobuchar. What do you make of it, and is it going to make any difference to Iowa caucus voters or to voters beyond Iowa? Let me start with you, Jeff.
I generally don't think endorsements make much of a difference, whether it's a person or a newspaper or news organization, except for like a union that delivers troops on the ground or the NRA, which speaks to single-issue voters. So I don't know how much difference it would make in either case. The fact that they split their vote is very interesting, and I think probably limits their ability to have any impact at all. The central decision I think a lot of Democrats face, I mean, people are deciding between Warren and Sanders, but it's the question of to what extent can we push for change and still get someone elected? That's the central question Democrats face. And by splitting their vote between centrist Klobuchar and left-wing candidate Warren, they really kind of make it difficult for someone to figure out what they're supposed to do.
You know, Nayela, the interesting thing, it almost got as much coverage as the endorsement, was the selfie that Joe Biden took with the elevator operator, Jacqueline, an African-American worker who, in a documentary that the New York Times itself was shooting, said, "I love you, Joe. You're my favorite. You're the one." And of course, Biden is saying, "This is my Jacqueline endorsement." And it kind of, plays to the stereotype of, lunch bucket Joe versus like the elites, right? What do you say to that? I mean, does it say anything really?
Well, I think to Jared's point, endorsements mean more to the candidates than they do to the actual voters. And particularly for the New York Times endorsements, people are getting their news information from other outlets. And so the weight of a New York Times endorsement may not necessarily carry as much sway as it used to have. But to Vice President Joe Biden's point, at the end of the day, the voters are the best endorsement. And so while candidates who receive endorsements make the most out of it, at the end of the day, it comes out to who are the voters going to support.
Yeah.
Nothing is like having the New York Times endorsement. Historically, if you have the Great Ladies endorsement, that's a big deal. But throughout the years, and you're right, Jared, it means less and less. Just last year, we saw how the New York Times endorsed their for Teach Out against Letitia James here in New York. And Letitia James ends up winning the primary and goes on to win the general election. They have been less consistent and less victorious with their endorsements as I think I have been with my predictions. So it's very interesting to see, but it gives you gravitas with a certain group of voters, especially those with a lot of money in New York, the liberal establishment, those that are looking for a candidate to donate to. And I think that splitting their endorsement is the New York Times hedging their bets against another possible loss in an endorsement race. And I think they did the right thing by at least considering the two females to make history in electing of the first female president. But then I think someone in the New York Times editorial board realizes that in order to beat Donald Trump in November, you're going to need a centrist. You're going to need someone that's going to bring voters in the Midwest. And I think they know Klobuchar is a candidate that is able to do that if push comes to shove.
Jared, last time you guys were here, we talked about the growing rift between the Warren and Sanders campaigns. It's kind of like tamped down, diffused a little bit. But if you follow social media, what hasn't diffused. In fact, what looks like it's growing is the anger that Sanders supporters have against the media, especially CNN and MSNBC. I mean, you read these tweets and it sounds like the Trump supporters talking about fake news. They're saying that the media and these two progressive news networks in particular are trying to torpedo the Sanders campaign. Is that true? And if so, why would they do that?
Well, I don't watch either network much because I spend all my time watching PBS.
Of course. That's why we have you here.
You know, campaigns
it's in the contract.
Campaigns and supporters work the refs. Some of the criticism is hyperbolic, but I think the charge sticks. I mean, there is a tremendous centrist bias in a lot of the coverage of the Democratic primary. You know, Sanders and Warren, I think more Sanders than Warren. There's always a bit of an archness to how they're covered, a skepticism. Sometimes it's subtle, like Bernie's ahead in the poll, but they show someone else's picture. Sometimes it's more direct, like the CNN questioner at the last debate who basically, you know, accepted the fact that Warren's version of the truth was correct and Sanders was not. The reasons for it are simple. One is that I think Sanders and Warren do represent a kind of change that can be threatening to the corporations that control some of those networks, and that does trickle down in some ways. Otherwise, I think, too, the reporters and editors probably do lean Democratic. They want to see a Democratic victory, and I think to some degree their skepticism of Warren and Sanders is strategic, is this belief that a centrist is who we need to win.
Yeah, you know, JC, last time you were here, you said, when I asked the question, the DNC torpedo or tried to torpedo Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016. I mean, it wasn't just their doing that he lost, but they try to help. And I asked if they were doing it again, and you said, no, you don't think so. But some are arguing, especially Sanders supporters are arguing, and this is how the DNC is torpedoing the Sanders campaign through their partners in the media, especially Jeff Zucker at CNN.
I gotta tell you, if you just have to see it, I mean, Bernie Sanders supporters are Donald Trump supporters. They think the same way. They think in this the system is nefarious. You hear the word rigged, fake news. You hear set up regularly, and it's almost as if you can easily the voters are just as rabid sometimes in their belief that the system is against them. If you hear the rhetoric is almost identical to Donald Trump's rhetoric, this idea that everyone's against me and creating a whole group of victims. That's another thing he does. Fact of the matter is this: Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. Bernie Sanders has had many an opportunity to register as a Democrat. He's not a member of the party. So you're going to have people that are Democrats even today, including Hillary Clinton, that blame Bernie Sanders for their loss. Bernie Sanders did a number on Democrats, especially in Michigan last time around. And guess who lost Michigan in November? Hillary Clinton. So there are a lot of people that are true Democrats, registered Democrats, that fought for the party their whole lives, that sees this guy who's a socialist talking about universal Medicaid-like health care insurance that takes away private insurance and sees him losing in November and don't want to risk that. So you're going to have a lot of people that are angry about it.
Now, are the Democratic, is the Democratic establishment afraid of a Bernie nomination?
I don't think so. I think it's important to note that a critique against Sanders is not rigging the election, as his supporters would like to tell you. I think it's important that every candidate that offers their leadership to be the presidential nominee be willing to withstand valid critiques of their campaign. And so I do think that the hero is Sanders and villain is media is a really simplified narrative of how complicated the primary process can be, but also to be willing to answer the criticism of his campaign and not necessarily say that it's rigged.
Okay. You know, last time we didn't even have much time, but we barely touched on some of the accomplishments that President Trump is already campaigning on. He's talking, his people are going out there with it, and he recently spoke at the Davos conference in Europe, where he focused on the economic achievements, which he assumes credit for, and of course he should to some degree, because if he failed, we certainly would give him the blame. Let me just give a brief list, and you can see it on the screen, of some of the ones that they talk about the most. Number one, almost 4 million jobs have been created since the 2016 election. More than 400,000 manufacturing jobs have been created. New unemployment claims have hit a 49-year low. Median household claims have hit the highest level ever recorded. African American, Hispanic American, and Asian American unemployment numbers have dropped to the lowest rates ever recorded for each of those groups. We've mentioned that briefly last time. Women's unemployment numbers have reached the lowest rate in 65 years, and of course, the stock market is setting records all the time. You know, the Democratic candidates, perhaps because of the fog of impeachment, have not, as far as I have seen, really reacted or responded to these numbers and the claim that President Trump is saying that it's his doing. How are they? How should they respond? And what are the issues that they have to bring to the winning issues that they have to bring to the voters in November?
Unfortunately for the Democrats this time around, we have culturally credited the president for national successes. It's always been the case, as you mentioned. You know, when President Obama took over after George W. Bush, we saw the economy improve. The whole country said, look, President Obama took the country from the worst recession in history since the Depression. We heard it over and over again. This time around, because we have done that, we have to somehow give credit to the fact that lowering the corporate tax rate, it was something that President Trump is going to take credit for. The stock market is booming. As you've mentioned, lowest unemployment records in history. Many Democrats are going to say he's just benefiting from the 8 years of President Obama's policies. And they're going to continue saying that. But the fact of the matter is that culturally, we don't do that. Culturally, we give the credit to the sitting president. And the fact is that deregulation has helped business a great deal. Whatever Democrat comes out of this fog, as you mentioned, is going to have to be able to look at the country and say, yes, unemployment is low, lowest ever, but vote for me because I'm going to do what? And that's what Democrats are concerned about. You have candidates that are saying, we're going to take away your health insurance. We're going to increase taxes. These are all of the things that people credit with the improving economy. That's going to scare the independent voters that are going to make the decision of who's going to win the presidency this year.
Nayela, how should the Democrats respond to these numbers? And what are the issues? What are the concrete winning issues that they have to begin to put out there to win in November?
The candidates need to essentially make the case on why they're the ones that can beat Trump. And to the point, the strength of the economy is definitely going to play to Trump's favor, regardless of whether or not he deserves any credit. The narrative is out there that he's taking credit for it, and the cycles of the economy worked out in his favor. So make the case that they are the ones that can beat Trump. And two, also reclaim the power of why they can also strengthen the economy. And also income inequality, wealth disparities, criminal justice reform, gun reform, immigration, climate change. All these are really important issues.
I mean, some of these issues, you know, don't poll well.
It depends on the base within the Democratic Party, but also the base within the Democratic Party that can change depending on voter turnout when it comes to the general election.
Jared, you know, the Democrats didn't win the House, didn't take back the House in 2018 by talking about impeachment. They basically did it in local areas by talking about health care. Actually, mostly. So what are the winning issues that these Democrats, whoever wins, have to bring to the voters in order to get their votes?
It strikes me that when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, we had enjoyed a long period of slow but steady economic growth, lowering unemployment, increasing GDP. And yet Trump was still able to make a successful economic/cultural argument for election, especially in working class states that were key to his victory. Obviously, the numbers are better now, but I would suspect that Democrats still have a chance to make some of those same arguments, because while many of those numbers do look great, inequality and some of the numbers closely tied to some of the anxieties that Trump tapped into, they still don't look that good. And so a candidate who can say, look, we know the economy is improving, your son has a job now, your daughter coming out of school has a gig, but are they making enough to sustain themselves? Are they still living at home? Do you feel as though you can take care of yourself in retirement? Are you caring for an aging parent? Do you really feel as though your medical care is there for you, or are you paying increasing premiums and deductibles and facing bankruptcy even though you have insurance? Those issues still exist if the Democrats have time to articulate that message.
JC, despite these winning, booming economic numbers, and despite the fact that the president and his team have been campaigning on it really for 3 years, let's face it, or at least for a year. All the national polls have the top Democratic frontrunners beating Trump.
Right.
All of them.
I guarantee one thing on this program right now. Whoever the Democratic nominee is will win the popular vote by millions of votes. That's not going to change the Electoral College. I guarantee that Democrats all over the country are going to come out in large numbers. You talk about voter turnout. If the 2018 numbers are any indication of how this year is going to look, you're going to see incredible turnout by Democrats across the country. However, those Democrats are going to come out in states where Democrats continue to win. New York, California, Illinois. You're going to see these numbers increase, so you're going to have millions of more people. But are they going to turn out to beat Donald Trump in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and in Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania? That's the question. And as of today, I don't see these Democrats that are front-running, whether it's Warren or Sanders, being able to tap into those centrist, moderate votes that you're going to need. These Democrats are going to vote for whoever the Democratic nominee is going to be, no matter who it is. I don't think you're going to be able to win those 3 states if you elect someone that is very liberal on the Democratic side.
But, you know, Nael, I guess JC is assuming that these polls are right. And he's saying, yeah, they're right for the popular vote. But I wonder if the polls are right. Obviously, they were wrong in 2016. Some people say you have to add 5 to 7 points to the Trump numbers in all these polls because people are afraid to say they are support. Do you trust these polls?
I don't. As a general rule, I do not trust polls. Polls are a snapshot, but snapshot with very limited information. I would be more interested in the approval ratings of Trump, which have a better indication of where the real support is on the ground. And also, I think in terms of the polling, at a very superficial level, it shows that the Democrats are doing something right in terms of messaging or organizing. But again, also that goes back to Newton's third law of for every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction. And so while the Democratic base is organizing and mobilizing, we have to remember that there's a silent majority out there that showed up in 2016 that nobody, and I use that in quotes, saw coming, but was very real and essentially turned Trump into our president. So with that said, I always take polls with a grain of salt. I'm always more interested in approval ratings as they're a better indicator of on-the-ground support.
Yeah, mentioning who's going to show up is key. I mean, polls always fall on the likely voter algorithm, you know, not who answers the phone and says Trump or Clinton or Trump or Sanders, but who's going to show up. That was what surprised people in 2016. That's the big X factor this year. It's way too early to think about national polls. There's no national campaign at this point. Trump's not up in the air. What they might show is movement, poll to poll, but in terms of an actual snapshot, I would almost toss it out.
You know, last time we were here, JC mentioned that he didn't think that the Iowa caucuses are going to mean anything. Whoever wins it's not going to be decisive. Jared, what primary or set of primaries do you think might be decisive?
I think South Carolina is critical because that's a diverse, large state, which is first two, despite their inordinate importance in our process, are not. New Hampshire and Iowa, probably the weirdest states to base our whole system on. And then Nevada after that. Nevada, fastest state, fastest growing, diversifying, very interesting. Those are really the two kind of gut check moments.
So you're nodding a lot.
Yes. I also share frustration in terms of why New Hampshire and Iowa shares such a disproportionate amount of power in terms of media leveraging and that part that controls presidential campaigns. But also South Carolina because of the black electorate, which is such a key core constituency of the Democratic Party. And to Jared's point, more people of color are moving into Nevada, and the demographics of America are changing. And so I think that's a really important part to consider on both sides of the aisle in terms of the changing American electorate. And with millennials are now officially the largest voting bloc. Whether or not this generation turns out to vote is another conversation, but there are new dynamics coming into play in the 2020 cycle that were not really part of the conversation when it came to 2016.
And JC, is it possible that we may actually not have a presumptive nominee by the spring, by April, and that New York, that's when we vote, that we may be the queen or kingmakers this time around?
Can I tell you, that would be exciting. I hate to see all the other states get the attention. You know, you're just talking about New Hampshire and Iowa getting it all, but why not New York? I think it'd be very interesting considering that you have so many of the candidates within a couple of points of each other throughout all of these polls, and Mike Bloomberg spending $250 million so far and just shooting up to about 9% or 10% in some of these. We don't know what's going to happen after Super Tuesday. This could very well be very close. And as Democratic voters are paying more attention, watching PBS and listening to me as I tell them that the only way you can win is by electing a centrist, maybe, just maybe, you'll have a Biden-Bloomberg primary coming into New York, and who knows what can happen in New York with a Michael Bloomberg and Joe Biden primary. I think that would be interesting.
That's interesting.
Exciting for PBS. We'll be back for sure.
You know, in a recent documentary in Hulu, I believe, Hillary Clinton said this about Bernie Sanders. He was in Congress for years. He had one senator support him. Nobody likes him. Nobody wants to work with him. He got nothing done. He was a career politician. It's all just baloney, and I feel so bad people get sucked into it. To which Bernie Sanders responded this. We have a clip. Let's hear it.
Senator, everything Secretary Clinton said was about your supporters and criticizing them.
All right, look. Secretary Clinton is entitled to, her point of view. My job today is to focus on the impeachment trial. My job today is to put together a team that can defeat the most dangerous president in the history of the United States of America.
Why do you think the Secretary is still talking about 2016?
That is a good question. Ask him.
That is a good question. One of the things that Hillary Clinton has said is that she doesn't want to run for president, but she wouldn't mind being president. And now she goes and says this about Bernie Sanders. My point is, if there's not a winner, even in April, if this turns out to be that thing that everybody talks about but never happens, a brokered convention, is it possible, Jared, and I want all of your opinions on this, that Hillary Clinton is looking at that, or that Hillary Clinton's name will arise, and perhaps even Michelle Obama's, the Democrats, I think, dream candidate?
I think it's very unlikely we'll have a brokered convention, but accepting that premise, certainly Hillary's name would come up, especially now that she's a likability expert, which is unknown previous to this. I think a lot of other names would come up too. I don't think that Clinton would be the name because we saw that movie 4 years ago. But I think in the craziness that would be, I suspect your or my name might come up. And I throw my support entirely behind you.
What do you think?
I think that if we're going to a broker convention, then the Democrats definitely have issues come November. Whether it's Hillary Clinton or Michelle Obama, I think those are very unlikely. I think that
Really?
I think that very unlikely. The bigger issue for a broker convention is, again, it speaks to the lack of the Democratic Party and voters really having the time to unite behind one nominee, which is one of the issues that happened back in 2016. Senator Sanders stayed on board until June, and by the time the convention came, it was still a very contentious convention. There was not enough healing time for supporters on both sides to kind of work through whatever they needed to work through. And I think that we saw some of that in the electoral consequences in November.
Okay, we have less than a minute, and I really want to get all of your opinion on this. Whoever wins in November, the other half, half of the country, or at least tens of millions of Americans, are going to think that the enemy won. We've lived through a divided country in ways that I've never seen before. The last 4 years, it actually started before that. What happens after November? Is it possible that we will move to bring the country together, or are we going to be heading down a very dangerous and dark future, Jared?
I think people underestimate how divided we've always been. I mean, we did fight a civil war against each other, bloodiest war we've ever had. This country's always been divided. That's a reality. It's always going to be there. I do feel as though it's more polarized now, and the next president's going to have to take some steps to heal those wounds best they can.
We're very divided. Even within our subgroups, we're even more divided. You hear it now. If you're not a Trump guy and you happen to be a Republican, you're a bad guy. You're evil. And if you're a Democrat and you don't happen to be down with either Bernie or whatever progressive movement, you're a corporatist. You're not a good. So I think we need a leader that's going to be able to unite all factions.
Niall, what do we got to look forward to?
I agree. I think that it's been made clear that we are deeply divided. But I think that what we do have to look forward to is, I think, essentially, we all want to move towards this vision of America that is fair and is equitable and allows everyone an opportunity. And I think that no matter what happens, win or lose, that we find a way to move towards that vision.
All right, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much for joining us today. You guys are always terrific.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, that concludes our 4-part series on the 2020 election. For continuing coverage, you can go to our website at MetroFocus.org, or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for watching. Have a great night.